The following is an Oklahoma history audiovisual presentation by Pat Homins, H-O-M-I-N-G-S, of the University of Oklahoma, and it came from the Stevens County Historical Society.
Led 1,000 Colorado volunteers in a raid against 600 sleeping Cheyenne and Arapaho women and children beside Sand Creek and slaughtered them. Reprisals by the Apaches, Kiowas, Comanches, Arapahos, and Cheyennes quickly followed. Forced to give up their remaining lands in the Sand Creek Reservation, they spread terror across the plains. The federal government responded by sending thousands of troops to the west to be trained as Indian fighters. Thus, the first policy attempted was one of Indian extermination. The soldiers soon demonstrated that they could do their job well. And while they did kill large numbers of Indians, they were not able to compel the Indians to leave the warpath. In October 1865, the government, faced with years of endless slaughter for both sides, met with the Indian leaders at the Little Arkansas Council. As a result, the Plains tribes agreed to live in peace with the white man. The Cheyenne, Arapahoes, and Apaches were assigned land between the Arkansas and the Cimarron in southwest Kansas and northwest Oklahoma. The Kiowas and Comanches accepted all of the land in western Oklahoma and the present Texas Panhandle between the Cimarron and Red Rivers. But the land assigned to the Indian was too large to satisfy the land-hungry settlers who began to intrude on Indian territory. A second council was called in 1867 at Medicine Lodge to discuss what must be done. White settlers were demanding that the government reduce the treaty-assigned lands and force the Indians into even smaller areas. Satana, Kiowa chief, spoke for his people. I have heard that you intend to settle us on a reservation near the mountains. I don't want to settle there. I love to roam over the wide prairies, and when I do, I feel free and happy. But when we settle down, we grow pale and die. A long time ago, this land belonged to our fathers, but when I go to the river, I see a camp of soldiers, and they are cutting down the trees or killing the buffalo. My heart feels like bursting with sorrow. I have spoken. 10 Bears, Comanche chief, also spoke. I knew every stream and every wood between the Rio Grande and the Arkansas. I have hunted and lived over that country. If the Texans had kept out of my country, there might have been peace. But that which you say we must live on is too small. The Texans have taken away the places where the grass grew the thickest and the timber was best. Had we kept that, we might have done the things you asked. But it is too late. We only wish to wander on the prairie until we die. Consider for a moment that you are the commissioners at Medicine Lodge. You have heard the arguments and reviewed the case. What would your decision be? Discuss this case among yourselves. The decision of the commissioners in 1867 was to reduce the land assignments for the tribes and to contain them in the Indian Territory in the driest section of western Oklahoma. The saddened tribes began to move into Indian Territory. The commissioners had promised them gifts and rations if they would settle in these new lands and continue to live in peace. The warriors waited. Still the gifts did not arrive. Feeling that the United States had failed to keep its end of the bargain, the Indians no longer felt compelled to keep their end. And the peace, once again, was broken. Small, heavily armed bands of Indians raided the frontier settlers and settlements in Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and Nebraska. The government, determined to keep peace on the plains, sent General Custer against the Indians. Crossing the snow-covered plains of western Oklahoma, Custer's forces located a large Cheyenne village at a bend in the upper Washita River. At dawn, he attacked the still sleeping village, killing the startled men, women, and children, slaughtering the ponies and burning the camp. Incidents like this between the Indian and the white settler continued. More federal troops were needed. As a result, 3 major garrisons were built in Oklahoma between 1868 and 1874 at Fort Supply, Fort Sill, and Fort Reno. For more than a decade, the battle between the white man and the Indian continued. But the pressure from the east, from the advancing, ever-closing frontiers, was too strong. The Army finally disarmed the warriors and took their horses. Peace finally came to the Indian frontier. For the Indian, the reservation was unlike anything he had known before. Forced to wait near the agency for his monthly dole of meat and supplies, he often found the excitement of the plains and of the hunt exchanged for a plow. A long trail that had seen the chiefs of the Comanche, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Sioux fall before the white man was coming to an end. The end of the trail. What is the statue saying? Could tomorrow be any different? Would tomorrow be any different? Could the lessons of history help provide a better tomorrow for the Indian? The saga of the Plains Indians is history. But today is also tomorrow's history. And for the American Indian, it must hold a new promise for a new era of unity, opportunity, and hope. The land that rolls away from the Mississippi, out of the eastern forest, and onto the great plains of the west, is noted for its greenness. But here at the southern frontier, the amount of rainfall decreases rapidly, and the characteristic forest green of the east gives way to brown and red. The land of the southwest, of Oklahoma, is noted for its particular beauty and productivity. But men did not always see it that way. In these early years of American expansion and development, settlers directed their lumbering prairie schooners around this territory, avoiding settlement on the wide grassy plains, and seldom seeing Oklahoma's rivers. Wagon masters headed for California. But why did the pioneers bypass this land? Early explorers like Major Stephen H. Long had seen the Oklahoma land and had described it as the Great American Desert. Long's description was reinforced by mappers of the area who, never having visited the land, would follow Long's suggestion that the region was, in fact, desert. The land appeared uninviting, suitable only for the Indians. Accounts of early pioneers seldom encouraged others to settle there. Look at the land. Don't look like good farmland to me. No trees, no water, streams dried up most of the time. How's a man to make a living in a place like this? Well, all right, but there might be a little of the Indian country worth having. There's a piece of good land down in the southeast. It sort of reminds me of back east. But it ain't much, hardly a third. Nope, I'm going on through to California. That's God's country. This conversation was typical of many held by those who saw the Oklahoma Territory, typical of those who turned their backs to the Oklahoma region and by the thousands passed it by. But by the end of the 19th century, a different story was beginning to unfold. April 22nd, 1889, dawned clear and warm in Oklahoma. For 3 days and nights, there had been a steady stream of people who had crossed the Cherokee Outlet in the north and the Chickasaw Nation in the south, and had lined up along a 30-mile stretch of land in central Oklahoma. At noon that day, 50,000 people began a gigantic race for 2 million acres of unassigned land, each seeking to establish his claim to a piece of the great American desert. It was the very same land that earlier settlers had passed by. Nothing really had changed. What made the difference? Who and what had been the change makers? Change in the Oklahoma Territory was the result of a number of factors. Look carefully at this and the following 5 frames and see if you can suggest reasons why each of these can be considered a change maker. At the end of the Civil War, Oklahoma was part of more than 1 million square miles of unsettled land. And although the area was due a rapid and sudden growth of population, it was not until the demobilization of almost 3 million soldiers that the region attracted any great interest. This sudden increase in population stimulated 2 related events: the near extermination of the buffalo and the substitution of range cattle for buffalo. Cattle, already an enormous resource in Texas, soon grew in importance until Texas contained more than 13% of the nation's cattle, but only 2% of the total population. In much of this region, where rainfall seldom exceeds 25 inches per year, obtaining water was a problem for those who hoped to raise cattle. The only dependable supply of water was from wells. But many buckets of water were needed to supply even a small herd. How could a reliable and continual supply of water be obtained from such great depths? The answer? Harness the wind. With a pump operated by a windmill, water could be drawn at a constant, steady rate. Can you tell by looking at this picture how a windmill operated? Soon, almost every small farm and ranch had a windmill for getting water from underground. While there was never water enough to change a whole desert into a lush green land, the windmill made settlement on the plains possible. It was one of the change makers which made people begin to look more carefully at Oklahoma. The cattlemen, meanwhile, continued to look with envy at the cattle towns of Dodge City and Wichita in Kansas. They were the markets the Texans needed. There was at the time no other method of marketing the steers except by cattle drives. Cattlemen would round up their steers and hire a group of cowhands to drive the stock from the ranch to the town for sale. These drives were often plagued by dust storms, stampedes, and Indians. This account by George Duffield illustrates some of the hardships encountered as he herded steers through Oklahoma. Swimming cattle in the order we worked all day in the river, and at dusk got the last of the beef over, and am now out of Texas. This day will long be remembered by me. There was one of our party drowned today, and several narrow escaped, and I among the number. His entry for June 1st recalls other difficulties. Stampede last night among 6 droves and a general mix-up and loss of feed. Hunt cattle again, and men all tired and want to leave. And in the Indian country, and am annoyed by them. Believe they scare the cattle to get pay to collect them. By 1870, 4 major cattle trails crossing through the Indian nation linked Oklahoma with Texas on the south and Kansas on the north. Names like East Shawnee, West Shawnee, Chisholm, and Great Western joined the names of settlements and towns like Boggy Depot, North Fork Town, Three Forks, and Perryville. Increased travel along the trail gradually began to change American views of this land once called desert. But it was the railroad, the iron horse, more than any other single change in the American way of life, that would signal the end of the Oklahoma frontier and hasten the closing of the American West. Steam locomotives, in their first generation at the time of the Civil War, soon became a fixture in the western scene. The development of the railroad progressed rapidly, and from 1865 to 1900 heralded a new day of promise for many who lived on the plains. In order for the railroad to be constructed, much land was necessary, land that often belonged to the Indians. Therefore, in 1866, government legislation forced the Indian to allow the iron horse to cross his land. These were some of the same Indians who had been relocated from their eastern homes in the 1830s, relocated on lands that the government believed would be forever theirs, land that no white man would want. Their right of ownership, however, was soon to be questioned, and companies like the Atlantic and Pacific and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe extended their right-of-way south and west, right through Indian territory. With each railroad construction crew came gangs of laborers to perform the tasks of railroad building and to fill jobs like supplying ties, timber, food, and other necessities. In return, many were promised extra pay or land where these people could settle and begin life anew. Many farmers who had no right to be on Indian land were casting a longing look at the vast amount of new territory. Some even tried to settle there, but were removed under orders from the Department of the Interior. But the railroad, wanting customers along track routes, and homesteaders wanting new areas of settlement, were soon to join forces to have Indian lands declared public and open to all. The Indians, of course, were opposed to this, and they were not alone in their feelings. Ranchers and cattlemen who had been allowed to lease grazing land from the Indians, or who had paid them for the right to drive stock through their territory, also opposed homesteaders moving in. The homesteaders' use of a new type of barbed wire containing metal barbs between two strands of wire, samples of which are shown here, caused additional problems. Suppose you faced a situation similar to the one these groups faced. Weighing the reasons behind each group's wishes for or against settlement of the Indian territory, see if you are able to decide whose will should prevail. How would it affect the future of the territory? From 1866 to 1878, the railroad sent men to Washington to lobby for a bill to open the territory. The Indians also sent representatives to Washington to oppose the legislation. Among those working for the railroad interest was a man named Elias C. Boudinot. In his study of the treaties and land assignments in Indian territory, he found that there were about 2 million acres of land right in the middle of the territory to which none of the tribes had been given title. Thus, it was considered public domain, subject to entry. So Boudinot reasoned that anybody, including homesteaders, had the right to claim it. In 1878, after he had failed to get a bill passed in Congress opening the land, he returned home and wrote a letter which he sent to the Chicago Times. The Times published the letter on February 17, 1879. telling its readers of the public land which existed in Indian Territory and of the fact that it was available to settlement according to the homestead law. Soon, Boudinot received letters from all over the country asking about the land. Each letter was answered, and with each answering letter, he sent a map and directions on how to get there. Almost immediately, people such as David L. Payne began to drift into Kansas and organize groups to settle the territory. Between 1880 and 1884, David L. Payne guided several parties into the land to try to settle there. Each time, they were thrown out by the Army, and some, including Payne, were taken to Fort Smith to stand trial on charges of trespassing on Indian land. Because cattlemen placed large advertising contracts with them, the border newspapers began to criticize Payne and his followers. Boomers, as these settlers came to be called, began to print their own newspapers and announcements concerning the unassigned land. These boomer groups also sent several petitions to Congress and printed leaflets attempting to gain public support. But by 1885, the boomer movement had run its course with the land still closed to settlement. Finally, William Springer of Illinois introduced a bill in June 1888 calling for the immediate opening of Indian Territory. It passed through the House of Representatives, but opponents were able to stop it in the Senate. For a time, it looked as though that bill, too, would fail. In an effort to gain its passage, the House attached the Springer bill as a rider to an Indian appropriation bill and sent it back to the Senate. This time, the bill passed, and the lands of Oklahoma were going to be opened. So on April 22nd, 1889, the unassigned lands were opened for settlement. On that day, the people gathered in line to race to a portion of the great American desert and claim it. At the sound of the gun, they were off. And with this one final chapter in the changing of the Oklahoma Territory, so went the initial development and settlement of present-day Oklahoma. While there were other runs, the last western frontier had been closed. And the word territory, well, that would soon change also. Put aside for another time and another place, exchanged instead for statehood. But there were questions to be answered before statehood could be thought of. Questions like, how shall we plan for Oklahoma's future? Should there be two states, one white and one Indian? When Congress passes an enabling act, how shall we form an effective government, beneficial to all? So plans were begun for Oklahoma's first constitutional convention. The change makers had taken the great American desert and given it life, and provided for the nation the 46th star. Policies and political procedures from other states. Some delegates wanted to borrow a social policy as well. Some of the delegates wanted to erect discriminatory laws which would deny black Oklahomans equal rights and dignity. These delegates wanted segregation, and they wanted it written in their Constitution. There were no black delegates present at the convention to protest this outrage, and it went unchallenged. But black Oklahomans had been among the first citizens of the territory, having arrived with the 5 civilized tribes. They accounted for 1/11 of the population, yet they were not represented at the convention. It was reported, however, that President Theodore Roosevelt would reject any constitution that provided for discrimination, so the action was postponed, left to the consideration of the first legislature after statehood. Republicans, under the leadership of Henry Ashe of Guthrie, fought the Constitution at every step of the way. Ashe was a highly successful attorney with the Santa Fe Railroad. Charles Haskell and Alfalfa Bill Murray had warned many of the delegates that the railroads and trusts would attempt to control the convention through Henry Ashe, and Ashe was living up to their expectations. The Republican dissenters, represented here by the railroad, formed and presented their own version of a constitution. When it was defeated, they tried various other tactics to block or obstruct passage of the convention's constitution. Unable to be effective at the convention, they waited until it would be brought before the people for approval. Then Republicans mounted a campaign against ratification of the Constitution. Here is a cartoon that was in an Oklahoma newspaper in 1907. Can you tell what group the newspaper supported? Do you think the newspaper was for or against the new Constitution? It was also charged by the Republicans that devices like referendum and initiative had given the people too much power. They claimed that these measures were far too liberal. They also charged that the provisions were hostile to industry and too favorable to labor. Among other things, the Constitution provided for workmen's compensation payments in case a worker was injured, and prohibited any agreement which limited this protection for the workers. The Republicans continued their campaign of denouncing the Constitution before the voters of Oklahoma. William Howard Taft, Secretary of War, was invited to make speeches in the territory. He denounced the Constitution, saying, "I don't think it's possible to amend it in such a way as to correct its defects. It needs complete revision." Democrats countered by inviting a popular Democrat of the time to speak in behalf of the Constitution. William Jennings Bryan followed Taft's campaign trail, hailing the work of the Oklahoma Convention. "You have the best Constitution today of any state in the Union, and a better Constitution than the Constitution of the United States. This is not extravagant praise. All the other states have stood as your model. I want to compliment the cornfield lawyers of Oklahoma upon having puttied up all the holes shot in the Constitution of other states by trusts and corporation lawyers." Finally, the issue was put to a vote of the people. The day is September 17, 1907. Should the Constitution be accepted or rejected? What would you do? Discuss the issue in your classroom and cast your vote. With a business-supported Republican minority and a farmer-supported Democratic majority, the Constitution was voted in. And soon the United States Congress had passed the necessary legislation, officially making Oklahoma a state. Celebrations were held statewide. The union of Oklahoma and Indian territories into one state was symbolized by a mock wedding ceremony in Guthrie. This rare old photograph, an Indian bride and a cowboy groom, represented the marriage of two territories. In the towns, however, black wreaths were placed on the doors of saloons, closed due to a Prohibition Amendment added to the federal Constitution. So Oklahoma, the 46th state, was ready to face the challenges that came with statehood. These challenges were not slow in coming. When the first legislature met, it contained many who had been leaders at the convention. They tended to reinforce the movement of giving more power to the people, taking power away from the wealthy corporations and businesses, and forcing lobbyists who might influence or corrupt politicians to register their group names, members, and purpose with the government. More protection was given the laboring class. New laws, including factory inspection, safety codes for mines, permission for formation of unions, and a state holiday on Labor Day were passed. Child labor for those under 16 was forbidden, and all between the ages of 8 and 16 were required to attend school. Teachers had to be certified, and special institutions were organized for teacher training. Additional financial aid was given to school systems which had suffered from lack of proper finances. But all students did not benefit equally from the increased concern for education. Black children were sent to separate schools from white children, with black schools financed from a separate, meager budget. Separate facilities in all transportation and public places were required by law, as they were in the southern states. Several years earlier, the Supreme Court decided that separate facilities, including accommodations on railroads, were legal if they were equal. This was conveniently ignored. And although black citizens protested this discrimination both in court and out, the all-white juries were not sympathetic and discarded their pleas for equal but separate facilities. Oklahoma again took its cue from the South and adopted laws which discriminated against the black Americans. These laws, signed by the governor, were often referred to as Jim Crow laws. To support the new government, money had to be raised. Money was collected by levying taxes on gross revenue from industry. Production taxes on pipelines, coal mines, telegraph lines, oil, railroads, telephone, and electric utilities were also levied. Income taxes were to be graduated. The less income one earned, the less taxes one owed the government. Money to run the government is needed in ever-increasing amounts. Can you name some ways your government raises funds today? So the 46 states joined the nation, forever to be a part of the Union, to fight for the country in times of war, to join with her in sorrow during hard times, moving ahead with the nation under a constitution providing for all the people, reflecting the concern of the founding fathers who had shaped the law, with some things borrowed, some things new. The Reverend James K. Thompson delivered a sermon familiar to generations of Americans. The title, Whither Are We Drifting? For many Americans, the second decade of the 20th century was a period of unparalleled growth. More and more people were sharing in the benefits of industrialization. Many Americans were indeed a part of the good life. For many in Oklahoma, this was also a period of progress and prosperity, of a change from agriculture to industry and the growth of cities. For many who live in Oklahoma today, 5 decades later, the period of the 20s is but a brief memory of a period of hectic change, of growing pain and conflict. What can the study of 50 years of Oklahoma history tell us about where we have been, or where we are today, of where Oklahoma and her people will be in the next 50 years? Oklahomans today are justly proud of the progress they have made, progress to benefit all of the people, the promise of better care for the sick, the aged, to remember the past, to cherish one's heritage, but to build for today, for tomorrow, to anticipate the future needs of the people, to plan for the future. Oklahoma today reflects the foresight of many of yesterday's farmers,
The results of this planning are plain to all who visit the National Cowboy Hall of Fame or hike and camp in the beautiful state park, or visit the hydroelectric project built to provide electric power for all who live in Oklahoma. But the costs of projects are often high. We see these costs as once clear streams, now stink of the smell of water polluted by man and the works of man. They reek of dead fish. They are clogged with debris. Social problems also exist. They are often the result of progress without planning, the result of reacting to problems in the same old way rather than seeking new solutions, knowing full well that history often repeats itself. But aren't there some things which we don't want to repeat? Can the problems and progress of 5 decades give us direction? How can we profit from these lessons of history to help us make wiser decisions now and in the future? Can a quick review of the past 50 years of Oklahoma history provide us with some insight into the past? Can it offer direction for the future? Let's try. The year 1917, and the United States is at war. War over there. For the first time in American history, the people of the United States are involved in a global conflict against the Central Powers and Germany. Quickly, Oklahoma men are joining their fellow Americans from throughout the nation at camps like Fort Sill, joining to fight to make the world safe for democracy. Oklahoma divisions like the 45th and the 90th are soon in Europe, where they distinguish themselves in combat. Many Oklahoma men will recall the names of Otis Leader and Joseph Oklahoma. But what about the home front? Many women in Oklahoma were working in the Red Cross and other organizations. Others joined in the war effort by raising victory gardens, collecting scrap metal, and conserving food and fuel. There were national and local campaigns to urge citizens to purchase Liberty bonds. Great pressure was put on citizens to support the war effort in every way. However, while most of the people of Oklahoma joined in the war effort, there was a small ragtag band of Oklahomans who roamed over the countryside protesting the drafting of men like those shown here. They burned bridges. They created other disturbances. They were quickly rounded up and arrested, and the so-called Green Corn Rebellion quickly came to an end. To some who lived in Oklahoma, the war brought a new kind of problem. In the uproar over loyalty, German citizens sometimes found notices mailed to their church doors, warning them that they must cease speaking German and must join with the rest of America as 100% patriots. The Ku Klux Klan, a national secret organization, spread into Oklahoma after the war. It was hostile to Catholics, Jews, the foreign-born, and blacks. Their tactics against opponents included physical force as well as political action. Handbills warned citizens that deadbeats and other so-called undesirables would be dealt with by the Klan. And from rallies like this, Klan members promised that certain undesirables could expect tar, feathers, the whip, the knife, and the country road. The war over, the state joined the nation in a period of social and economic unrest. With the increase in manpower resulting from returning troops, wages were cut. Farm and oil prices went down. Strikes were common, and the Klan became even more active. The Klan was very anti-labor and pro-business. It fought all political groups and organizations which tried to improve the lot of the common man. It tried to divide the laboring men on issues such as race. Violence became the Klan's method, and intolerance its watchword. Many gave it credit for instigating the terrible bloodbath which broke out in Tulsa in 1921. 9 white and 70 black were left dead. The trouble arose when a white mob decided to lynch a black man from the city jail, and black people tried to defend it. Mob then set fire to the black section of town, burning 2 miles of homes and businesses. The fear and suspicion of radical left groups blinded many to the radical right Ku Klux Klan. The legislature changed the color of the Oklahoma flag from red to blue because of the association of red with communism. Foreign languages were outlawed in schools below the 8th grade. In 1923, Jack Walton was sworn in as governor. After campaigning on a platform which called for public ownership of utilities, cotton gins, coal mines, packing plants, and stockyards. He supported these and other measures advocated by some farm labor groups. However, he was opposed by both the Klan and conservative lawmakers from both major parties. The question became, how well would Walton be able to get along with the new legislature? Walton tried to appease conservatives and liberals by granting favors to both. He ended up angering both. His strong actions against Klan violence finally brought his downfall. After less than a year in office, the legislature impeached Governor Walton and removed him from office. The next governor, Martin E. Pratt, was able to push through the law that Walton had unsuccessfully called for, the law to unmask the Klan. An attempt to impeach Pratt failed, and the Klan, although weakened, still survived. In 1924, strikes and violence broke out in the coal mines when mine owners refused to keep the wage contracts they had made with the miners' union. The strike lasted 3 years until finally the strikers lost. Other old traditions were challenged in the 1920s by such girls as the flappers, who shortened their skirts and hair while demanding new freedom. How do you think more conservative citizens reacted to them? In 1929, Oklahoma impeached another governor, Henry Johnson. Indeed, the 20s was a stormy period for Oklahoma. Why do you think this was so? What were the roots of the unrest and turmoil? See if you can discover it. How can we profit from such insight? In 1929, the entire nation was shaken by an economic collapse, which was signaled by the stock market crash on Wall Street. The Great Depression had officially begun. Unofficially, the depression had begun for Oklahoma cotton farmers years before. Cotton prices had slumped due to competition with new cotton-producing countries such as India and Egypt. Western Oklahoma suffered from a combination drought and wind. The Dust Bowl was created, and unprotected, uncovered soil was thrown into drifts like these. Man had carelessly grazed livestock until the land was stripped of grass. He had plowed up more and more soil in hopes of greater yield and profit. He left the soil no protection against the merciless wind. Dust storms, such as the Black Blizzard, turned day into night in Oklahoma City streets. Dust clouds extended 500 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean. Many Oklahomans left their state and fled west in search of work. During the 1930s, 22% of the people entering California were from Oklahoma. But the poverty-ridden Okies were not welcomed by the Californians, who saw them as an added burden. Only a picture such as this can express the suffering of these times. Poverty was now the lot of the many who could not be ignored. The government, state and national, had to do something. but what? Governor William H. Murray called for a National Council for Relief, which met in 1931. He also set up a commission to detect tax evasion and try to equalize tax assessment. Later Oklahoma governors cooperated with the federal government in work relief projects, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps shown here. And while some men struggled to bring the nation back to normalcy, other men around the world plotted its destruction. Suddenly, in 1941, the nation was shocked by President Roosevelt's announcement that the Japanese had attacked the American fleet in Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1931, a date which will live in infamy.
The USS Oklahoma and USS Arizona were among those ships sunk. Oklahoma soon became the location of new military bases, prisoner of war camps, and war industries. The state's interior location was seen as secure from attack. When victory was won in 1945, Oklahomans, black, white, and red, had fought and died for their country and for the freedom of the world. After the war, black Oklahomans continued to struggle for their freedom at home. In 1946, Ada Louise Chappelle, an honor student at Langston University, applied for admission to the University of Oklahoma Law School and was rejected on the basis of race. In 1949, she won her case. George W. McLaurin in 1949 was admitted to graduate school at the University of Oklahoma, but was forced to sit behind a railing in a special household. The court finally ruled that such insults were unfair and interfered with learning. Black children and Indian children went to inferior schools, financed from a separate and much smaller budget than that of white schools. But a step forward was made in 1955 when the separate budgets were united. This action was demanded by the 1954 Supreme Court decision, which decided separate schools to be unfair, unequal, and insulting. Oklahoma began to move slowly toward integration of schools. Public accommodations, such as food counters and public stores, refused to serve black customers. Feelings ran high when black freedom marchers in Oklahoma City began a sit-in. They peacefully remained in seats, waiting to be served and refusing to leave. After years of bitter struggle, discriminatory practices were outlawed. In 1959, Howard Edmondson was elected Oklahoma's youngest governor. He initiated reform programs which included the use of a merit system to promote fair practices in hiring state employees. He eliminated bootlegging of whiskey in Oklahoma by obtaining voter approval of the repeal of prohibition and established state-licensed package stores. In 1963, the death of Senator Robert S. Kerr was a great loss to Oklahomans whom he served well. Senator Kerr encouraged the industrial growth and development of Oklahoma and helped sponsor the bill providing for improved navigation on the Arkansas River. The years since 1960 have seen unparalleled growth for Oklahoma and for the citizens of the Sooner State. A call for excellence in education has spread across the state. And while the costs are often high, Oklahomans can feel proud of the fine colleges and universities located throughout the state. Industries of all kinds have moved to Oklahoma, bringing with them jobs for thousands of men and women, all men and women, without regard to race, creed, or national origin. And for those who find the heritage of Oklahoma and the nation exciting, there are many fine museums like Stovall in Norman, or Woolaroc in the heart of the Osage Hills, or the Museum of the Five Civilized Tribes in Muskogee. And in her towns and cities, the decade of the 60s was one of growth and expansion. A master plan is already in effect that will provide good housing for all Oklahomans. A time to tear down the old and build again. In small towns and in the cities, new architectural designs give Oklahoma an exciting new skyline. And so, as Oklahoma approaches the last quarter of this, the 20th century, we close with a promise. The promise that Oklahomans may feel a sharp sense of pride and accomplishment. For where there are people, so there is triumph. Where there is evidence that man has spoiled, there is the promise that he will make clean again. Where there is congestion on streets and highways, new superhighways promise relief. Where the cities have seemingly exploded in all directions, there is a plan. The old gives way to the new, and the senior, and the young. 5 decades of change in Oklahoma and in the nation offer both a promise and a challenge for all who live in Oklahoma today. And if the problems seem quite large, remember that the answers in many cases are still up to you. And the knowledge of Oklahoma history can make you a wiser, better citizen.